All right. Well, Don, thank you for giving a uh, running start into day 6 and then an overview of day 6. Appreciate that. I already told him I'm calling it an introduction to day 6 because there's much more to discuss here in day 6 that I want to call your attention to. And I mean no disrespect, Don. You did a fine job. It was always my intention to discuss many more aspects of this than you had time for, quite frankly, in the um, one night that you were given. But before I do that, I'd like to answer a question that was posed at the end of the time. And I noticed that Don deftly sent it to me to answer, but I'd like to answer it because I was intrigued by it when I heard it. I went, oh, that's an interesting question. The question came from Mr. Leek over here, who asked, is evil a created thing? And the answer is no, because it's not a thing. It doesn't exist as a thing. Now, it does exist within time and space, obviously, because it cannot exist in the nature of an eternal God, by definition. He is holy. And yes, it does exist within the framework of the material world, but it is not a created thing. It is a thing that came about by virtue of the actions and choices of free creatures who themselves chose to act contrary to the nature and directives of the law of God. And so the necessary reality is that it is not created per se. It exists um, as a philosophical concept within the framework of a world that exists in a material sense, but it cannot be created per se. God did ordain it, that is true, and God did allow it, that is also true. And one could say that God even purposed it in the world, if that means the same thing as ordained. He did purpose it to accomplish his greater plans and goals, but he cannot be the author of it. And as the creator, therefore, it cannot be a created thing. It can be a philosophical reality within the frame of time and space, but it is not per se a created thing. Okay? Now, as I said, I think there's more to discuss in day 6 in terms of the creation of man, the second half of day 6. It's interesting that God created man in the second half of day 6 rather than giving man an entire day unto himself. Okay, but I don't think there's any significance in that other than just the reality that it is. And part of the reason that I think we need to talk about more deeply in here is a couple of different reasons. Number one, I've said many times, and I continue to stand by this, that if you don't get your anthropology right, your soteriology will go astray. If you don't get your view of man correct, you will find yourself wandering in your doctrine of salvation quite significantly. It is important that we have a solid understanding of who man is, what man is in relation to God, his creator, and in relation to the creation itself. It is essential that we understand those things in order that we do not wander off into myths when it comes to the issues of salvation. What is the nature of man? You know, we'll talk about this later when we get to chapter 2, but probably the best example is that the vast majority of evangelicals and Pentecostals in the world today think of man in a semi-Pelagian state. And if you're not familiar with that term, it comes from the philosopher and theologian and monk Pelagius, who lived in the middle part of the 4th century, who suggested that Adam's fall did not actually corrupt human beings. His sin, original, did not pass on, his guilt and pollution did not pass on to others, that man is capable in himself of keeping the law of God and responding to God's commands. Augustine pushed back hard against him, of course, to suggest no, quite the opposite. Man is himself deeply corrupted by sin and is incapable of responding. Pelagius' argument was Well, if God says you have to keep the law, you must be able to. Well, that's a logical fallacy. Any first-year logic student would tell you that. The fact is that just because God commands it doesn't mean necessarily that we have the ability to do it. The logic is built on a fallacy. But a semi-Pelagianism permeates much of evangelicalism because the basic assumption amongst much of Christendom today is that, well, no, we're not able really to be righteous in the sight of God. I grant you that. But God has still left us, or we've still been left with enough natural spiritual abilities to at least respond to God when he calls us to Christ. Okay, that would be a semi-Pelagianism. It would be okay, we're not all the way to Pelagian, but we're kind of flirting with Pelagius a little bit in the sense that, well, you've heard it put this way, right? God does his part and you do your part. And of course, the semi-Pelagians of our day would say something to the effect of, well, yeah, what we mean by that is there are a great number of steps between us and God. God takes 99% of them, we take one. And so, yes, it's a semi-Pelagianism only insofar as that we have some response. But no matter how you cut the pie, that leaves you, unfortunately, with a soteriology that must be, by definition, synergistic. Because God has done his part, but it's only effective unless you do yours. I suggest to you, I put it before you, that that is actually a bad anthropology. The problem is where you're starting. What's the starting point? The nature of man. What is the nature of man? What is it to be a man? And so I am convinced that you really need to have a solid biblical understanding of man. And if we understand man from a biblical perspective, I would suggest chapters 1 and 2 will give us an initial understanding of man, which is then demonstrated to be different by virtue of the fall in chapter 3, which becomes then the basis of how you understand a soteriological work of God. How then is our salvation wrought? And of course, we would argue from a monergistic perspective rather than a synergistic one that this is a work of God from beginning to end, because we are not naturally in ourselves as Adam capable of doing what is required or even responding to God. Or as Paul says it so eloquently in Ephesians 2:1, we are dead in our trespasses and sins. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why we really need to probe what's being said here in day 6, in regards to what man is. Or we might say day 1 of man's existence, okay? I would also suggest to you that one of the reasons I want to plumb this depth more is because I quote from this passage quite regularly, don't I? And apparently, many of you are quite obedient to the command that's found in it. Be fruitful. Okay? We quote from this. And the reason why we do that is because you will notice that it's really at the core of much of what it means to be man within the framework of the biblical revelation. What is it that we are? What is man in relationship to God? Not just in relationship to salvation, but in the totality of what it means to be human. All right, so this is really laying a foundation for us of every single aspect of what it means to be Adam, what it means to be man, what it means to be human. So we got to spend some time here plumbing the depths of this day. And so I want to do that in a couple of different ways. And I'm trying to keep all these thoughts in my head at the same time because there are so many things to talk about. What I hope to do here is over this week and next to plumb the depths of this section. I want to talk about something in relation to man that you see in verses 26 through 27. And then I want to come back next week, Lord willing, and discuss 28 and beyond, which I call the creation mandate. So I want to talk about the first half of the nature of man and the relationship of man to this created world, and then talk about the creation mandate that follows behind it in 2 separate weeks. Because as you know, in about, 7, 8, 9 days from now, I'm going to be heading to Kenya. And so I'm going to have 3 Wednesdays that I'm going to be gone, and I've asked Brother Mike Hill to come and teach on the 7th day I'm giving him 3 weeks to discuss the seventh day. In other words, I want him to plummet deeply. And I've already given some suggestions on what to talk about. He could talk about the seventh day as it appears in Genesis 2. He could talk about the seventh day as it's then regurgitated in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And then he can talk about the Sabbath day as it's understood from a Christian perspective or a New Testament perspective. Frankly, that's a sermon series. So I'm giving him 3 Sundays or 3 Wednesday nights to work on that. So pray for him as he prepares, and then come and give him the same respect you give me. Wait a minute. Give him better respect. Okay. All right, let's look at what we see here in the 6th day. We're going to be looking specifically at the second half of the 6th day. Verse 26. Then God said, let us make man, let us make Adam in our image, after our likeness, and let them, plural, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Give him dominion over the 3 main areas of animal life that God had already created: sea, air, and land. Okay? Now, I want to call your attention to a word that appears numerous times in Genesis chapter 1 that's worthy of our observation. It's a word that appears here several times, and I think we need to look at it in depth. And no, it's not the word good. Okay? I bet you were thinking that, right? It's thinking, oh yeah, he's going to go after that word good. Nope, different word. In fact, it's a word found in verse 11, 12, 21, 24, 25, multiple times, and then appears again in Genesis 6:20, 7:14, and then appears again in Deuteronomy 14, Exodus 47, and in a different form appears in a different form. Oops, let me click that so it actually expands. Appears again in, clicked on the wrong one, sorry. Appears again in in Leviticus 11, multiple verses in Leviticus 11. Anybody figure out what word I'm talking about? Nope. Kind. The word in verse 11, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. See it there in verse 11? You also see it in verse 12, trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. You see it again in verse 21. God created the great sea creatures, every living creature that moves, with which to watch the waters swarm according to their kinds, in this case a plural version of it, but still the same word, and every winged bird according to its kind. And you see the same thing in verse 24, the creeping things and beasts of the field according to their kind. Verse 25, the beasts of the earth according to their kind, the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. There's an old axiom in Bible study, which is that if you see a word or phrase repeated multiple times, it's the theme. Now, I'm not sure in this case it's the theme, but it's a word that deserves our attention given its repetition, don't you think? The word itself, I have no idea how to pronounce. I am not a Hebrew scholar. It's something to the, I guess one version of it is the word min. Another version of it is the word, another version, the one that's used most frequently here in Genesis. Yeah, it's the same word, min. Okay. I saw a different variation of it some other place. Okay. It's the word min. In itself, it means, it means simply the word type, according to its type. But there's a more modern word that would actually fit better here. Anybody know what that word might be? Species. Every creature according to its species, according to how it is distinguished from other similar things. Now you'll notice that as I read the verses, that phrase is applied to everything that has life. Plants, birds, or that which is in the heavens, right, or in the atmosphere, in the sea, and on the land. And multiple times in some cases, where on the land, even multiple times. Cattle, livestock, creeping things, according to their kinds. Okay, there's a sense in which this word is being used, I think, to demonstrate this massive diversity of creatures created by this planet, on this planet. We know that there are millions of species of creatures. We can't imagine how many there might have been before the flood, and many of whom have since died off since the flood. We don't know. But we know today that there are millions of different types of all these things, right? Think about all the different types of plants. Trees, bushes, grasses. I was reading an article some time ago that there are literally hundreds of thousands of species of grass just by itself. Mowing yours, right? But you probably have multiple kinds in your yard, even. There's a great diversity of plant life. How many different kinds of trees are there? How many different kinds of bushes are there? And all the other kinds of plants, like those weeds that I killed off with some Roundup today in my front yard, right? I mean, all kinds of these kinds of things. The massive diversity of the flora and fauna on this planet, right? I mean, Moses is emphasizing this by virtue of God saying it. This is what God said. Let the water swarm with every imaginable kind of creature according to its kinds. So there's millions of species of sea creatures. Leaves me with a couple of questions here. Let me just insert a parenthesis here, okay? Put a big parenthesis right here. When were insects created in all of this? Anybody know? Problem is, it's really hard to tell. Here's why. Who could tell me what the 6 major categories of animal life exists on the planet? I'm going to test the homeschool moms here, okay? What are the 6 major categories of animals on the earth? Anybody know? No. Just the general categories at the top of the head, at the head. The 6 categories. Okay, mammal and reptile, that's good, that's 2. Amphibians, good. That's a subcategory. Birds, fish, and one more. Did you say it? Rebecca, did you say it? No? Invertebrates. Invertebrates. 6 major categories are mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, fish, and invertebrates. Those are the 6 major categories. Now, below that, then you start driving into hundreds of thousands of subcategories. You know, you talked about them, Melanie, various different forms below that, right? It's all kinds of those. It is suggested by most that insects belong in the invertebrate category, okay? Because they're really none of the above, right? And so they belong in that category. And yet, they don't neatly fit there. It's kind of the problem. They don't neatly fit there. So I'll offer a theory. I can't prove it, and it's open to debate. I would suggest to you that God created the insects as a part of each of the uh, two worlds he created when he created the animals in the air and the animals on the land. In other words, those descriptions that we have, for example, of birds in verse 20, let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures and let birds fly above the earth. That word birds isn't limited to just blue jays and things like that. It includes basically anything that flies. In fact, we have another place where that particular word is used even to describe bats. So I would suggest that the word for birds here is basically everything that uses the air as a means of locomotion. In other words, everything that can fly. So a dragonfly is a form of this particular creature flying here. So basically, mosquitoes and flies and gnats and all those other creatures are probably the kinds of things that are being spoken of here in this section. Then when you get down to day 6, then you have God creating the other kinds of insects that now crawl on the ground. Okay, so you've got arachnia, right? Spiders, okay? And then you've got all the other kinds of insects that go along, like beetles and locusts and grasshoppers. In fact, the same word that's used for creeping things here is the same word that in other places describes locusts and so forth. In fact, I don't know if I have that pulled up here, but there's one particular spot where in the Levitical law, maybe I do have it over here, in the Levitical law, there are certain of these insects that you're allowed to eat and certain ones you're not. I don't think I have it in front of me here. I think it might be in Leviticus 11, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? So my guess is that God created the insect world. See, the thing is, we have a tendency, don't we, to think of the insect world being distinct from the other animals, don't we? We kind of put them in their category all their own, because these are, I like the way that Don put it, they're not just creeping things, they're creepy things. Okay, so they're creepy. We don't like them. So it seems reasonable to me that when God formed the air creatures, he formed those creatures that could use the air, then he formed the land creatures, those who are subject to gravity and can't use the air, okay? So that's just an aside. A second aside. Are there dinosaurs in this picture of creation? Say what? Big reptiles, giant lizards. Yeah. In fact, the word dinosaur literally means giant lizard. That's what it means. So yes, there's room here for dinosaurs. Now, see, here's, and I have a point with these parentheses, okay? You think, oh, look, he lost it again. He's lost. No, I'm making a point here. Okay. One of the things that we need to do as we consider this text is we need to remember that we are being pushed hard by an evolutionary perspective of how to understand this world, okay? We are being told today that there was a time 65 million years ago when these giant lizards roamed the earth, and then something happened, a meteor fell from heaven and killed them all, or an ice age came and killed them all. Nobody can seem to make up their mind as to actually how it happened. But they roamed the earth, and man and dinosaurs were, as they said in the Jurassic Park movie, separated by 65 million years. Not according to this text. God certainly created large beasts, right? Verse 25, God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground. So that beast term can be a wide open range of things like reptiles. And as you know, reptiles never stop growing while they are alive. So imagine a reptile that lived 1,000 years. How big would he be? He'd be one big lizard, wouldn't he? He'd be one big creature. It's reasonable to assume that the dinosaurs died out, as probably did many other creatures that came off of Noah's Ark because of the change of climate that occurred. These giant reptiles, cold-blooded creatures, couldn't handle the change of temperature that would have come as a result of there no longer being a canopy. And now lifespans fall dramatically after the flood, don't they? I will contend with man, his life will be much shorter. So there's room in here for all these other creatures. Okay, close that parenthesis. Here's my point. God creates this massive diversity of creatures upon the earth. And he makes this statement every time he does so, according to its kind. But that word for kind is never used to describe a human being. Never. Every single use of it throughout, in all of its forms, every single use of it refers to some animal of some sort. It is never used to describe. God does not say, let us make man according to its kind. He does not do that. Rather, the juxtaposition of that phrase is found, let us make man in our image. There's a very real difference here. And let me suggest to you why that's important. There is only one form of man. I don't want to use the word species because the Bible doesn't use the word species, right? There's not multiple species of men. There's not multiple races of men. There's not multiple types of man using this kind of word. It's not there. God intended for there to be a single creature distinct from all of what I just described in being formed in his image. And let me suggest to you, if I might be so bold, that all of the various divisions that we make amongst men are utterly artificial and post-fall. So today when we talk about races, there's no such thing. Because man was not created to be of different species or races. Sure, Dominic, my African brother in Nairobi, who I spent an hour on the WhatsApp today talking to, comes from a very different culture, has a very different skin color. If I'm white, he's black, trust me. And he comes from a very different language. He speaks Swahili, although he also speaks the King's English pretty well too. But he's from a very different culture. He's from a very different place in the world, geographically. I mean, there's so many differences between us, it's hard to believe. But we are not of different species. And technically, we're not even of different races. There's only one race, and that's the human race. Adam, let us make man, Adam, was created by God not to be like these other creatures in their various kinds. That's the juxtaposition of this phrase. And if I may be so bold, let me suggest also that the reason for the reality of that, put that in your mind and think about it like this. What did Christ come to do? He came to erase those distinctions, those divisions, those kinds that we have all made up by virtue of the fall, by bringing us back together as one. Redemption is to bring humanity back to what he was originally created to be. I would suggest even greater than what he was created to be, but at least at a minimum what he was created to be in the first place. A man, regardless of these outward characteristics, that are one humanity in Christ. What color was Adam when he was created? Don't know, do you? What language did he speak? Don't say Hebrew. Came a lot later. Right? We don't know. The intention is that man was created to be a unique creature. And when God says, let us make man in our image, what he means is let's create this singular creature, not creatures after their kind, but creatures that are a creature, a singular creature, who himself will, yes, fall into sin and then find himself dividing all up. I mean, the Tower of Babel will be a great instance of man's rebellion against God. And so God says, okay, fine, I'll separate you. But the gospel is that Christ comes to bring all of that back together again. Let me point out something else, too, if I might be so bold, that you might not have noticed. Look at verse 11. Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. Let me ask you a question. What does that first phrase mean when it says, let the earth sprout vegetation? Okay, let's do it again. How about verse 24? And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. You see that? Most kind of pass right over that. It's like, I didn't really notice it. Let the earth bring. But think about it. There's something being said there. Let the earth bring forth these plants. Let the earth bring forth these creatures. You ever notice that? Now, at first glance, you kind of pass it over and think, okay, is that all that important? But let me suggest there is. Okay. I would suggest to you that the creation of humanity is contrasted with that phrase, because the creation of humanity is what we call an immediate act of God, whereas the creation of plants and animals is a mediate. Okay, take off the I am in the front of immediate. Mediate. We would use the word mediator from the same word, something through which it comes. Much of the earth, much of this early creation was what theologians call mediate. Now, obviously, we believe that God commanded the earth to bring it forth. He planted, quote, the idea of what it was that he wanted the earth to bring forward. Okay, so God gets the glory here. This is not the earth springing this out randomly. Okay, this is God directing, sovereignly ordaining what should come forth from the ground. Same thing in terms of the animals, that they would come forth. But theologians have noted that this is what they call a mediate creation. The sense in which the creative activity of God was done through other means, plants springing forth from the earth rather than being individually formed by God and placed there. Now, how exactly he did that, I don't know, but that's the way it's written. Doesn't deny that God created it, doesn't change the fact that God is ultimately the one that created, but the idea of this is the sense in which it was immediate, was mediate. Adam, however, is different. As we will see in Genesis chapter 2, man was created immediate, meaning not through a mediation, but God himself coming and taking that same dirt from which the plants had come, from which the animals had come, and forming it himself personally, I dare I say intimately, into the form of a man. Very different form of creation of man than animal. See, one of the things that the evolutionists want you to think, they'll say to Christians all the time who believe in creation, they'll say, well, we're humans, we have very many of the same characteristics as animals, right? Especially as mammals, because they would call us mammals, right? They would put us into the species of animals, the species of mammals, right? They would call us Homo sapiens because we come out of the category of mammals, okay? And they say, well, we have all these same differences, right? They reproduce, we reproduce. And in mammals, very much the same way. We have our children alive, we birth our children alive, and we nurse them, which is the characteristics of a mammal, right? We do these things. So obviously, so I don't know what you're talking about, this uniqueness of man, because we look very much like other creatures. But the argument, again, is a fallacy in that what we have is a description here of God ordaining for animals to reproduce as they do, which looks similar to us, but the distinction is found in how we were formed to begin with. God said, let there be all kinds of creatures that would walk this planet and reproduce. In fact, he does say to them, be fruitful and multiply, doesn't he? He does say, be fruitful and multiply. Notice he doesn't say, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. He does say fill the waters in verse 22. But there's a different sense to the multiplying and filling of man. Why? Because man is different, unique. God created him to be distinct from these other creatures. All you got to do with your evolutionary friend who wanted to make this point and say, okay, let me ask you a question. You say that we reproduce exactly like all these other creatures. Okay. If you've ever been on a cattle ranch and you've seen a cow have a calf, right? Calf falls up. What's it do next? Stands up almost immediately. And then it begins to nurse. And how long does it take for that calf, generally speaking, to become utterly independent? Less than a year. Most beef cattle will become completely independent within 6 to 9 months. And mama cow, usually is pregnant again already by the time that this one is ready to go. How long does it take to get your child to walk? How long does it take to get your child to become independent? I know, that's open to much debate. I realize that. But it ain't 6 months. In fact, your child in 6 months is still absolutely and utterly dependent upon you. If you left him on his own, he'd be dead in a day. Right? So, okay, true, we have some similarities in the sense that we produce in some similar fashions, but there are some very significant differences. And I've often used the illustration, and I'll use it again. One of the most interesting things to me about the reproduction of human beings is that a child can learn to speak before he can learn to use a toilet. Have you ever noticed that? Now, which of the two of those do you think is more complex? Which of those two do you think is more complex? Speaking. Think of what it takes for a person, a child, to observe his parents, watch them speak, listen to the words, begin to mimic the words, and then string the words together to make complex concepts come into play. I want that cookie. He learns how to do that, even while he's still in diapers. You notice that? No, we are not like these other creatures. They were created of their kinds, meaning there's massive diversity. And additional to that, they are mediate rather than immediate. An additional thing that I'll have you notice here, if you look closely at verse 26, and I took this from Berkhoff, great Presbyterian theologian. He notes this in verse 28, that the creation of humanity was preceded by a solemn divine council. See it? It's as though Moses is recording God's interaction within the Trinity itself. Let us make man in our image. Who exactly is that spoken to? Who's that spoken to? It's within. The Father saying to the Son saying to the Spirit, and so forth. Let us make man in our image. Let us agree to do this. The triune nature of God taking counsel among its members to decree something specific and unique. And nowhere else is that ever said about any other thing. God explicitly speaks amongst himself. Father, Son, and Spirit. It says, let us create man. The way that Berkhoff puts it is, or what I'm paraphrasing him, he says, since the formation of humanity was the goal of the decree of this council, all of the subordinate creation is assumed within it. Thus, the divine decree to create humanity assumes all the rest. What else was created? Well, in order to create man, we're going to need to have a place for him to live. And since we've decided that he needs to breathe, because I'm going to put my breath into him, I'm going to make an atmosphere. And because he's going to need to eat, I'm going to create the plants of the field for him to eat. And additionally, I'm going to create this massive diversity and this amazing separation of land and water in order that he will have something to do. He will have a place to work. Now, again, we will see that when we get into chapter 2. But isn't that the first thing that God does? What does he do when he takes the man? What does he do with him? He puts him in the garden, he puts him to work. Go work the garden. Now, I don't know what that work looked like. I can guarantee you it's not the work you did. It was better than that. But it was a job. He gave him thing to do. And the creation mandate, as we get into it next week, Lord willing, is going to help understand that reality, okay? And so this solemn divine council is really itself a distinguishing mark of this creature that's being created. God himself, within the framework of the Trinitarian nature of Father, Son, and Spirit, said, let's do this. It's an agreement and a council that was taking place. So, and of course, we would look at the us pronoun in the midst of it and say, okay, it's obvious that this is referring to a Trinitarian act of God. It certainly can apply to other beings. As we learn in the book of Hebrews, the first chapter, God doesn't consult angels for these things, right? So it wasn't an angelic being that God turns and says, why don't you and I create something? Obviously not, okay? It's within the framework of God himself. So man was created, according to this, with a specific type, distinct from all other creatures. He was created in an immediate act of God rather than immediate. We get that in this case just simply as an echo of what we've already seen, because all other things are created in a mediate fashion, not an immediate fashion. And then it's preceded, and importantly, by God having a divine counsel within it. Now, there's one more additional fact about this that really belongs in chapter 2, but let's just pop it in here so we have it in our minds as we go. And that is that the creation of humanity was also the creation of a duality of nature. A duality of nature, whereas animals are not spoken of ever in this sense. You and I possess, by virtue of the imago Dei in us, we possess both a body and a spirit. Body and a soul, body and a spirit. There are some theologians who want to talk about a tripartite state where we talk about body, soul, and spirit, but I'll stick with just the dual aspect of it from my perspective. A duality of nature. God made this creature distinct from the other creatures by virtue of making him have a nature which was both mortal and immortal, or body and soul together. Okay, I call it mortal and immortal. It'll become truly mortal when death comes, but mortal and immortal in the sense of physical and spiritual simultaneously. Animals don't have that. Animals have rudimentary forms of sentience, which we typically call things like instinct. I mean, Little baby bird just pops out of the egg, right? And eventually mom pushes the baby out of the nest and the baby goes plop and falls on the ground. But then it brushes itself off and it flaps its wings and takes off. How did it learn that? Well, it knew instinctively. Animals know instinctively how to survive. They know instinctively how to reproduce, right? They know instinctively how to do these things. They know instinctively where to find their food, find their mates, find their protection. They know where to, all these kinds of things. They know instinctively how to do this. They don't have to be taught. That little baby calf that I mentioned earlier doesn't have to be taught by mama how to be a mom herself, assuming she's a heifer. But if she's born a bull, he is born a bull, he inherently knows what to do with that. Doesn't have to be taught. Doesn't have to learn. He just knows. And he knows that those other bulls that are in the pen better not get in his way. That's instinctual. It's not a function of rationality. He's not thinking it through, right? We anthropomorphize animals all the time, right? We tell jokes about creatures and they speak, but that's just anthropomorphizing. That's not reality. But human beings are unique. We do not possess instinct. We possess rationality, the ability to think and make decisions about how to live, how to protect ourselves, how to find food, all those kinds of things. And it's built into a much bigger reality in regards to the Imago Dei, which is not limited to just a few things. It's broad and wide. And Lord willing, next week we'll talk about that before we get to the creation mandate upon which it's built. So I wanted to draw those four things to your attention about this creation of man, how he's created, and in comparison to how animals, plants, etc., are created, in order to make this clear. We are not just some species of animal that happened to evolve up to a place where we're smarter than other creatures. No. We were created explicitly by our Creator to be unique. One of a kind. One of a kind.